Hi everyone, so today we're going to talk about where you get your fishes, whether you go for captive bred or wild caught, and there's pros and cons for both in a variety of ways. I prefer to go for wild caught for most of my fishes, but it really depends on the fishes and what's available to me, so this really depends on your country. So there's so many pros and cons to each. So first I'm going to go through wild caught because this list is, I would say, a little bit longer in some aspects. So wild caught, the biggest issue of topic that a lot of people come up with is that these fish are abstracted from the wild, and there's also a conservation aspect to that. So whether you're taking too much on a small population, or even where they're not, that population might be quite small itself, or even you're just taking too much for the whole species, and their sort of replication rate in the wild that they can't rejuvenate, they can't replenish themselves. The other aspect to this conservation thing is it does, by catching the fish from the wild, it does provide a value. No species is conserved if it doesn't have a value, whether that's monetarily or just a value sort of potentially spiritually, potentially also as an aspect of aesthetics. People will travel to see it, which all of it comes down to economics in the end. So it does provide a value. So if you conserve these species, particularly if they can't be captive bred, they're more likely, if you want to conserve what you're using as a commodity. Otherwise, if you're taking too much, you're going to lose that commodity and you're going to lose that income. Therefore, it does provide a real value on preserving that, not just the species but the habitat, and that's why you probably see it with other sort of taxa or organisms where there's a value. The higher the value, the higher the conservation effort, and that's why a lot of keystone, would it be keystone species? But some species are used in conservation effort, sort of to publicise different areas more than others. Take in general reefs for marine environments. You got elephants are used, maybe tigers might be used. Tigers sort of for the Indian, sort of not just the Indian but the native habitat. Rhinos for like, all of these just create a focus, and people are more likely to conserve what they're familiar with, what they like. They're not going to want to conserve this endangered snail so much. So it is also aspects of economics, and that goes on to economics of the local people. So the local people that will be abstracting these fish, an aspect, it does go into conservation as well, that these people, assuming they're getting it not via, like, say, cyanide fishing or methods like that, it does create an income, an economy. It prevents them going to other aspects where they can make money to feed their families, to survive, such as deforestation, monocultures. And therefore it has its pros, whereas people think of it just people trying to make as much money as possible, and there is that sort of middleman aspect as you go up the chain. But it provides not just a value to the species from a sort of wider context of people further away, but also local people, and also they might want to think about looking into whether they're going to conserve, whether if you're just after the juveniles, you're going to leave the breeding population more or less alone. So this means that they're going to think about maybe conserving these, the breeding population, maybe not using them for other things such as sort of, I guess, sort of fish meals or anything like that. Just an idea. Another aspect is science, and this is a bit of a difficult one. So wild caught does give access and knowledge of species that you wouldn't get that are captive bred, because not all can be captive bred. It does sort of give an insight on what's around that. Science might have does have limited funding, and if something comes through the trade, then it can highlight maybe there's gaps. These specimens can also be used to study in the aquarium or in other aspects, such as taxonomy, especially with wild caught where you've got locality. Otherwise, we can just look at how species change as well. There's so many different uses of just wild caught. So the biggest aspect for me with wild caught, and why I really struggle entirely with captive bred, is the health of the fishes. So the biggest one is in the wild, they are going to have the largest genetic diversity. This means that their gene pool is going to have a lot more different alleles. There's going to be a lot more variation, and you're going to have variation between populations as well. And if you're getting them from the wild, you can say, I vaguely think they're from this population. If they're captive bred, they could be mixtures. And hybridizing or crossing different populations of the same species can be as bad as hybridization. It kind of asks what's the difference between what is a species really and what's a genus. But they will have that higher genetic diversity. That means they're more adaptable, most likely, to change. So a change in the environment over time. It also means maybe more adaptable to disease. These fishes, not just are they, and this goes into what I put as natural ecosystem, they're gonna most likely be carrying more diseases, which sounds bad, but this does give an added aspect of immunity, or they've encountered more diseases, so they have a wider adaptability to disease and a wider range of diseases. Some of these diseases, and disease I mean mostly pathogens, that can give them an aspect of not just immunity but digestion, defending against other diseases, not just those ones they've encountered. Another aspect is, it's the same with captive bred. If you're mixing fishes from different populations, they can transmit diseases to each other. And wild caught, wild caught I think is probably less of an issue with that. Morphology, these fishes, it's same with genetic diversity. These fishes are going to have so much of there's no human bias with selection. No matter what you do in captivity, you're going to be selecting the best or ones most adaptable to captivity in your aquarium. This doesn't mean that you're making a big conservation pool, because they're adapting for captivity, they're not adapting for the wild so much. So they're being selected in that way. There's other aspects, as it's difficult not to say I want these two to breed because they're nice fishes. I don't want this one looks a bit manky, I won't use that one. But in nature, even what we see as maybe a bit unusual, that could be part of their natural sort of system. And it's impossible to make those decisions, I feel. Making those decisions on who can breed and who doesn't is not what nature chooses to who does breed and who doesn't, which I think is very different anyway. That it's going to be using different selection pressures, and you see that even with time. Let's take the silver fox. So this is was a domestication experiment on I think it's a variation of Vulpus vulpus, which is the red fox, and they only selected for friendliness to humans. So you could say the same with, you're selecting for the fish that feed the best in captivity. But over time, with this selection for friendliness to humans, these foxes developed a range of colours. there is didn't stand up so well. Their tails went curly, and none of those traits were selected for. So a lot of genes can be connected to others, so I think that's just really good to think about. And you are getting a fish that is maybe, which I would say is definitely more natural, because there is no buzz. And I always look at discus, and a lot of domestics have that sternum, which is this region here, so where your sort of chest plate. So this is the pectoral girdle in fishes. I don't have a skeleton of one that's big enough and intact enough to show you, but it's almost sticking out in a lot of captive breds. There's also no influence of diet, like the captive diet, on what it could do with juveniles. Also potentially psychological influences from captivity that could be passed down through epigenetics or just other aspects of captivity that will influence the offspring later on, and maybe even diseases they're exposed to from completely different sides of the world. Whether you want to keep fishes from different sides of the world is up to you, but there is that aspect that they might not be adapted to each other, maybe so much. And I would say definitely that genetic diversity is key. You're never gonna beat that with captive breeding, because there's always going to be a smaller gene pool, and it'd be a good idea to sort of, you could cross different populations and that would create that bigger gene pool, but then you're playing with whether hybridization is good or not, and it makes those, as a captive population that you want to keep as pets, that's fine. If you want to release it in the wild, no. It's the same issue of the American tiger. The American tiger is often a hybrid of a cross of different subspecies, and I think potentially species, I'm not entirely clear. That makes those tigers just not viable to release into the wild, because they are not the same different variants that you see in nature. They're probably not even adapted, say, to the colder temperatures of the Siberian Amur, I think it is an Amur tiger, compared to maybe adapting to the hot environment of the Bengal tiger. The biggest one with, the biggest factor with wild caught we cannot deny is the environment. So there is a level of damage from pollution. You've got to travel to sites, and a lot of, so the transportation is no different whether they're captive bred or wild caught. They've still got to be transported, and likely if you're buying them in the UK in stores, they will have been transported across the world. So that's the same with captive bred. There is the aspect, you are catching, if you're catching them from the wild, you're catching them in a river, you might be damaging parts of the river to get in. You might be leaving fishing equipment behind. I would say it's less likely, because especially if it's artisanal fishing, the equipment's going to be quite valuable. It might be difficult to replace in many parts of the world, so it's not going to be something that you're going to leave behind. There's also the pollution of the sort of the middleman, where when it's going from sort of, it's being collected and then they're sort of being sorted before. I think they often go to another place before they get transported out, but that's the same with captive bred, but captive breds to a high extent. So I don't know if this is bias, but I wrote a lot more faults for captive bred. So I'll put that in a second video, I think, and that'll make it easier for people, because this is going to be really long otherwise. But wild caught isn't also bad. We often think about fishes being caught from the wild. It's almost, there is that anthropogenic sort of sympathy with it, and sometimes there's a lot more to a story than you think, and it's really worth researching and really thinking about it. Many fishes, if you only want to go for captive bred, will not be obtainable, such as a lot of loricarids, a lot of, well, apart from the common bristlenose anyway, quite a few fishes there's the untold whether they are captive wild caught, and this can put pressure on them in the wild, and it has done. And I think the biggest thing we can do is distribute our pressure, not on a few species but on many species, and that will, and sort of maybe distributing it in levels of whether it's going to threaten the species so much. Say, so clown loaches are exported and likely wild caught in their thousands, and this is putting pressure, and it has been shown to put pressure on them in the wild. It's juveniles being caught, which isn't so bad as breeding adults, although I'm not sure if they're used in culinary in the food industry, which is a bit of a double whammy. You're taking the breeding adults, then you're taking the juveniles. Potentially just the juveniles, but it has been shown to put pressure on them in the wild. Instead, we could be distributing between ones which we think can manage it, maybe they can have a bit more. And also it means not being obsessed with keeping certain fishes, not having to have that red-tailed black shark. I know they're captive bred now, but in the past they are critical, I believe. And by distributing that, you're really helping not just maintain that species population, creating a value for it, but also maybe look at other ones that can manage a bit better. And why does everyone have to have this species? Why does everyone have to have a gold nugget when you cannot keep it in captivity to adulthood, let alone breed it? And I'll say, why does everyone have to have a red-tailed black shark when they cannot even keep it in a group as they do in the wild? Or what other ones would there be? There's so many, like at least with the gold nuggets, Balancistrus anthellus, they are really numerous in the wild, so you're putting less pressure on them. As far as I know, they're numerous, and people that have been there have said so. So there's a lot more to think about, and there is so many species that are forgotten, and it's so many trends. We don't all need to have what someone else has, and if you find something a bit unusual, I think there's a bit of a value in that. Anyway, thank you for watching. I will put the captive breeding video out in a bit. Thank you.